I'm breaking down 4 new mechanics that any level player can take advantage of. I'm starting off with the most basic of nuances, and then later on in the video I'm going to get more in depth and advanced. Now keep in mind there are some controversial takes, so be sure to stick around. Now let's get into it. So my first piece of advice is that your wrist is stronger hinged up and down than it is out. So now why is that? I got my friend Zayed here and he's going to provide an example. So now hold your paddle out pretty loosely as if you're in a handshake position, or what we call continental in pickleball. What we can see right here is it's quite flimsy. I can push it around, and keep in mind he's holding it not too tight, not too soft, like he's not breaking the bird that he's holding, but he's also not letting it fly away. Now this same exact position, now what we're going to do is hinge it up as if pretend we're throwing an axe like this. Now you're going to hold it out with your wrist hinged up. Notice how much stronger this position is with the same wrist tension. And so now when you drop your paddle face as well, drop your paddle like this and maybe turn it. And so now that you hold tension at the bottom as well, this is also a little bit stronger than it is when it's out. So now what do these 3 spots mean? These 2 strongest spots of your wrist being up as well as your wrist being hinged down allow you to expand your sweet spot because of that extra tension created in your wrist. So a good rule of thumb when we're hitting dinks and ground strokes is that you want to drop your paddle face when hitting forehands and then hinge your wrist up, pretend you're throwing an axe when you're hitting these backhands. Now that's why you see a lot of these pro players like even J-Dub, Ben Johns, they all hinge their wrist back rather than dropping it down to hit these backhand dinks. So when you're hitting backhands in specific, hinging your wrist back expands your sweet spot because of this tension in your wrist and therefore creates less shanks and less unforced airs. Now if we also have strong positioning when we drop our paddle face, why not do it for our forehands as well as our backhands? Now be sure to stick around because I'll explain that later on in the video. Now my second piece of advice is that chicken wings can be a good thing. While chicken wings are genuinely taught to be a bad habit, you can utilize them in certain scenarios to be an advantage. So I'm lefty, so keep in mind a lot of this is mirrored for a righty. So if I'm in the middle of a hands battle with my opponent right in front of me, sometimes instead of opening, the ball gets behind me a little bit too much. I can then take it more out in front with this chicken wing. So the chicken wing is generally caused by your dominant shoulder and hip being the most weak parts of your body to counter. But what you can do in order to change these spots right here is by simply sliding. So for example, if the person in front of me speeds up, I can take time away from them by taking this ball early enough with a backhand counter rather than being late, opening up and hitting that forehand. Now to even get more in depth about the nerdiness of the chicken wing, think about the geometry behind it. When I'm sliding and countering this ball, my paddle face angle does not change drastically. It remains the same throughout my entire swing. However, when I'm hitting this forehand and opening up, it is extremely tough to not have deviation when you're doing this big motion back here. Notice right here it's face down, it's open, then we go down again. We do not have to worry about that deviation of paddle angle when we're hitting that backhand counter. Now let's take a quick break from the current video and tell you guys that this video is sponsored by Pro XR. Now currently my paddle of choice is the 12.7 Proto Hype. This thing hits like an absolute nuke, so it's exactly what you need going into 2025. I've been using their paddles for over 2 years now, both generations, and I can tell you guys that they are definitely one of the most innovative paddle brands in the sport. Zayed, the best 5-0 in Austin right here and part of Longhorn Pickleball, uses it, endorses it, and loves it. So if he does, then you definitely need to as well. Once again, thank you Pro XR for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. Now my third take is very controversial, but it's to lock your tui upwards when hitting two-handed backhand dinks rather than dropping it towards the ground and hitting it downwards. Even though you can still get a hinge dropping your hands down like this, you don't get the strongest hinge. That is when it is above, and because of that, this is when your sweet spot is going to be the largest. Now we already see the best player in the world, Ben Johns, uses this mechanic for his two-handed backhand. James Ignatowicz, J-Dub Johnson, they all use this example. Now there are some pros that drop their paddle face and hit tuis like this, but in my opinion, the trade-off that you get for more spin is not worth it for less placement. Because when we're hitting dinks, placement is the most important thing that we need to evaluate. Now getting into the nerdy bit of this section, let's talk about the difference in contact point between dropping your paddle face and keeping it upwards. When I'm dropping my paddle face like this, I'm taking it way more out in front. Compared to if I have it hinged back, I'm more likely gonna change my zone to on my back foot in this little, I call it a pocket. And so I know some of you are saying take it earlier with this roll instead, but in my opinion, taking it further back is not a disadvantage. By taking it later, instead of taking most of these balls on the rise, I'm letting it rise all the way to the apex and even bounce and even drop a little bit before I can swing away with it. So because your paddle's way more out in front when it's facing towards the ground, you're taking a lot of these balls on the rise. Compared to when I'm hitting this when my wrists are hinged upwards, I'm taking this a little bit later, therefore letting the ball rise to the apex point and even dropping a little bit. And so the biggest advantage this gives you is it forces your opponent to pick a side before you truly hit the ball. If you're taking a lot of balls off the rise, your opponent never picked a side because they're just waiting there in anticipation. But when you let the ball bounce, apex, and even drop a little bit, then they're most likely gonna slide and get a little tense because they're waiting so long for the ball. There's a great example in my most recent rec play where I actually held it so long that the person cross court from me slid right towards their line cross court rather than covering middle, and that opened it up for me to hit that speed up winner. So because my contact point is a little bit later, yes, some balls are able to get behind me a bit more, but because that's where my pocket, my contact point is located, it's not a big issue. I think the trade-off of more placement, more control, as well as forcing your opponent to decide on a spot commitment before you actually connect with the ball is a very, very worthwhile trade-off to hit your tui hinged upwards rather than with your paddle facing towards the floor. Now this last section is one of the most underused patterns that I see in pickleball. And that is if your opponent is slicing their third shot drop, you should almost always roll and speed up that next fourth ball. This is an easy 60-40 or sometimes even 70-30 pattern that just never gets used. I don't know if it's because players get tight or they don't want to end the point early or whatever it is, but this definitely needs to be utilized more when they hit these slice, loft, float drops. Honestly, the only reason a fourth ball shouldn't be sped up is if it's getting rolled towards your feet or if they're hitting a laser-like drop that's coming to your feet and you're still not prepared for it. Now, a great example of being hyper-aggressive on fourth balls is Johnson Cola. He's been using this strategy for years and it has yielded him so much positive results. So those are my 4 most important nuances to take away from this video. Thank you to ProXR for sponsoring this. We couldn't have done this without you. And let me know, comment down below if you have any questions or if you have any pushback and if you think that dropping your tui down is better or whatever. But as always, I'll see y'all next week.